Hello, this week we come to the 26th Sunday of the year. We're following what are known as the B readings. The first reading is from the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verses 25 through 29. The second reading comes from the letter of James, chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. And the gospel comes from Mark chapter 9, verses 38 through 43, 45, and then 47 through 48. I thought that we would begin today by looking briefly at the second reading, which we have been looking at over the last few weeks from the letter of James, and this is the last time that we will be hearing from James. The James letter, of course, pictures very practical approaches to life, and in fact, one of the themes we have noticed in this particular letter is that it is important to have faith, but if faith are not illustrated by action, by works, then one wonders really whether the faith we have, that is the faith in Jesus and in his teaching, is really part and parcel of their lives. The reading we hear this time, which is toward the very end of the letter of James, it's a relatively short letter in the New Testament tradition, speaks about wealth. And it's an exhortation of the rich, accusing them that they have become rich at the expense of the poor, by defrauding the poor. In other ways, those who get rich are relatively few. Now, it's important, perhaps interesting to notice, that in the first century world, in the Mediterranean world, of which, of course, the contemporaries of both the writers of the Gospel and of the other letters of the New Testament were part, found that there were three important kind of aspects of life, namely status, power, and wealth. And in this world, status is that which indicates wealth and power. Unlike, which is the opposite, and we who are part of what is called the Western world, find that it is really wealth that often produces status and power. Think about it, and we certainly have many examples in our own contemporary world to notice that those with money have a great deal of control over power and position. But that was not the situation in the first century world. It was the other way around. And status came from birth. You didn't acquire it by some deeds that you did yourself, but it was by the very fact that you were born into that kind of society. And if there was such a thing as conspicuous consumption, it required that those who had this status needed wealth. Now, how did one achieve or keep the wealth that one had it? And that really meant that you achieved it at the expense of others. So wealth, when you got a lot of money, were able to build up what certainly even in our own time we found was a surplus. And when you had the surplus, it now created new obligations, and you became a patron, that is status, wealth, patron, and you distributed the surplus wealth to people in need who then became your clients. And they, of course, now owed things to you because you were their benefactor. And in order to increase the honor and the status of the one who was making sure that you were a patron, he was a patron for you, a client, required real increased wealth. And how was that achieved rather? By taking advantage of the poor. And that then, of course, brings to what the reading is that James is saying. This is not what should, those who are wealthy, that is, those who are experience this and not helping those in need, will pay the price. So the writer of this letter is very practical, as we've mentioned, and down to earth. Because, as we mentioned, in this world, there is no justice for the impoverished and exploited. And the writer says, well, they will receive justice in the last days. Well, when is that? And again, we've noticed on many occasions a thought running through some contemporary Christian communities of the time that the last days were imminent. Well, that of course did not happen, but nevertheless, it does not take away from that being a part of the thinking of the times. So all of that is a little bit of a kind of background as to what the reading today, which sounds a little bit out of place, but when we put it into context, I hope makes a little bit of sense. That it's not necessarily, and this would be challenging, that those in position of wealth, and you do remember, we've noticed this before, that in this tradition, those who enjoyed the good things of this life were considered to be doing the right things, and those who were not were often thought that they were poor because they had done something or didn't do something that they should have. But when you look at the whole issue of status, one notices, therefore, that this is not the reality that is taking place. All right, so I did want to as we conclude listening to James, and I invite you to go back and read this whole letter. Notice how very practical the writer is. This, by the way, was one of the letters that when the Reformation period took place, for a while was excluded from the collection of works that made up the New Testament because there seemed to have been an issue with regard to faith and works. But in fairness, and notice that this letter is not opposed to faith, but rather the argument, as I mentioned as we began, made by the writer is that it's wonderful to have faith in Jesus and his ways, but if you did not share it, if you did not carry it out in action, then what kind of faith did you really have? And so this writer sees the balance. Faith needs to give rise to good works. Now, does good works strengthen faith? Well, it certainly shows that one's belief are carried out in reality, and in that sense, it does. All right, so all of that looking a little at this letter. We come now to the reading from Mark this time, chapter 9. It begins by a report coming by one of the 12 disciples. This is John. It's the only time that really in this gospel he ever says anything. Points out to Jesus that there is someone who is doing good works, that is exercising, chasing out the evil spirit in the name of Jesus, but they are not part of our community. So they, obviously speaking for the other disciples, we assume, are not part of our group, and therefore, why should they be doing this? Now, this little first part of the reading can be divided quickly into three little sections. Verse 38 is John's report, as I mentioned, about the way in which he and other disciples have dealt with an alien exorcist. Now, one of the kind of interesting questions here is that the very use of the language that is used by the author, not that he is, by his action, doing something against Jesus, but is he not doing something against us? That leads to wonder whether or not the original question was posed to Jesus, or whether this was a concern that had developed in the community of Mark by the fact that he is talking in the plural, and that would refer to the disciples, and Jesus is obviously not there. The next, so I said there were three parts. That's the first part. Second part is Jesus rejects this proposal, and in fact gives his approval in the third section of verse 40. So, as we said, the question that originally had arisen was exactly who is concerned about someone doing good works that are not part of our community. Jesus' response, which is an interesting one and an important one, says, well, look, anyone who is not against us is for us. So Jesus, in effect, is he putting down John and the disciples, or is he at least offering an explanation here? Now, interestingly, this quote, anyone who is not against us is for us, could be used positively. And that's, I suspect, how the writer here intends it to be. It, however, could be, and other writers of the time, by the way, this phrase was not simply one that is attributed to Jesus, could and did use this phrase in the negative way. If one is not for us, then they are against us. And so in that sense, you can see that there is a criticism of this. That's not, however, I would suggest, the way in which this is interpreted by the Markan writer. All right, so that's the first part. It's important, of course, the background for all of this is that there be an important issue of the recognition, that is, of an important issue of the time, namely group loyalty. Now, group loyalty revolved around the fact that a group gathered around a leader, and they pledged and displayed their loyalty to that leader by their actions. The disciples of Jesus are pictured here as wanting to safeguard the distinct identity and prerogatives of their group. So, if someone outside is doing the things that Jesus did, there's a problem here, because obviously they are not loyal to Jesus. Then who are they loyal to? And they're not loyal to us either, that is, those who are the disciples of Jesus. Now, the phrase goes on to say that anyone who gives scandal to these little ones are worthy of, and there's a kind of powerful image here, of having a millstone tied around their neck and thrown into the waters. Now, little ones here, and we have noticed this on other occasions, are not children, but rather adult followers of Jesus, whom he sometimes calls children. So notice how the phrase or the understanding is employed. So there is a concern here about those who rupture the faithfulness or loyalty to the little ones that they have to the Lord. Now, first century Mediterranean psychology, which is not at all introspective, but rather is based on values attributed to external this mentions, I don't know that there's an English word for that, about human life. So, well, what about the millstone tossed around the neck? Now, this would be, you have to know a little bit of, the text seems to be talking about a donkey millstone. Now, why do I say this? Because remember, millstones were used for grinding grain, and it would go around in a circle, and the donkey would pull the millstone so that the grinding process would take place. There were, on the other hand, what were known as hand millstones, namely just a small millstone which the user used with his hand and could grind things, I suppose, in the kitchen or something like that. Point here being, it seems that it is a donkey's millstone that is tied around someone's neck, and if you do that and throw them into the water, the chances of their coming to the surface are, shall we say, very, very minimal. So is there, as I often noticed for us, sometimes little exaggerations that get attention. And I mention this because I think that point of exaggeration now continues in the material that we hear next. And what does that have to do with the fact that those who harm little ones will receive, well, some kind of a punishment. Now, here, let's look this time. I point out that this becomes kind of rather interesting, that one needs to look at the way in which the human person was looked at in both literature and sometimes even literally. There was what we call, and notice, a tripartisan or tripartite division. Namely, when one looked at the human person, there were hand, foot, and eye. And each of these, now both symbolically and I suppose when one looked at it practically, might indeed match reality. So the hand was considered to be the instrument for the commission of sin. The foot was the means of transportation to the place of the commission. That is, the commission of what? To the sin. And the eye was the means in which the temptation to commit the sin enters. So you see, three parts of the human anatomy all contribute to that which is wrong. Now, we don't always probably think of it that way, but that's how this and why it is probably important to notice as we hear the reading this time. So, as I mentioned, the Hebrews considered the human being consisting of these three interlocking zones. So if you think of zones symbolized by parts of the body. Now in that regard, hands and feet symbolize, as we mentioned, purposeful activity, causes one to stumble during what? Tests of loyalty. And that goes back to the point that I made a few minutes ago. It's all about loyalty, and loyalty to Jesus and loyalty to Jesus' community. And whoever causes one to stumble during these tests of loyalty, there must be some effort or some kind of action that puts an end to this kind of behavior. And since the eye, and the eyes here, therefore, are the ways in which things enter into the heart. So it's interesting. Eyes are considered to be the windows of the soul. well, we often use that phrase, but again, this whole kind of anatomy looking that is part of the ancient world, and certainly part of the Hebrew tradition, is interesting to notice. So if the eye, the organ that feeds information to the heart, is unreliable in the tests of loyalty, then one must take service action to halt the damage. So, am I going around in a little circle? Yes, because now notice what is being said here. If the hand is the offender, cut it off. If the foot is the offender, cut it off. If the eye is the offender, pluck it out. Now, please, and I do know there are some who tend to read the scripture and say that everything must be literally taken. Could be very dangerous for those who hold that position, because if therefore they committed a sin with the hand, well, they would lose the hand. If they committed a second sin, they'd lose the other hand. If they considered well, they couldn't. Well, you see how this is really kind of not ridiculous, but got your attention as to what is important. Now, did people ever literally do these kind of things? I suppose one could say. I don't know. The writer Philo, who was certainly contemporary of the first century Christians, and even we think might have been a contemporary of Jesus, commends people who bite off their tongues rather than give secrets to those who are torturing them. So was that a reality that he thought people really should do when they were being tortured? I don't know, you can check the writing of Philo and see this a little bit further. Also, there was this connection between the parts of the body with certain actions of doing wrong. So the hand was considered and connected with theft, fraud, forgery, things that you needed your hand to do. The foot was connected with robbery, persistent thievery, connecting runaway slaves. So the foot. And then the eye was considered to be connected with adultery and with sexual misconduct. So that was another way in which the analysis of the different parts of the body took place. Now, this is in many ways, as I mentioned, not somewhat foreign, rather, to our Western culture, but is perhaps interesting to notice as we look at this section of the gospel. So as I say, if hands and feet symbolize a purposeful activity which causes one to stumble, then you need to eliminate this. Now, how do you do this? Cutting it off. Well, I suppose we could say, in English, if you cut off that practice, then yeah, that you're doing good, and that's what you should do. And I suppose from using a kind of symbolic interpretation is worthwhile doing here. There are a few other points I'd like just to kind of make to this section. But let me back up just a little bit to give a moment to look at the first reading, which comes from the book of Numbers, which you remember the disciples, as I should have probably included this a little bit earlier, complained to Jesus that there is someone who is doing good, who is not part of our group. The reading from Numbers pictures the point that at a certain time, Moses says to the Lord, I'm doing all of this work for you. I'm teaching, I'm organizing. Things are becoming, well, a little bit more than I can handle. Now, whether Moses thought this himself or whether others noticed it, led to the proposition that Moses is now asked to share his power, that is the power of leadership, of making decisions, with a group. And so there are gathered 70 members of the Hebraic community, and the spirit of Moses comes to them, and so that they will carry out and carry on the work of Moses. But Joshua reports quickly to Moses that there are 2 men who were not with us who have this same power. And how did they get it, and how should they be treated? Now, they were not with the group when this action took place. What we're not sure of, and we're not told, why they were detained from the camp, why they were not in the assembly when this gift was given to them. So we don't know we don't have answers to those questions, but we do know that these men were outside the camp, and therefore were not the professional interpreters of the Spirit which had been given to Moses. Joshua tries to stop them. Moses' response to them is, "Are you jealous of them for my sake?" And then makes a very interesting and important conclusion. "Would that the Lord might bestow his Spirit on them all." So here is perhaps the connection you can see of this reading with the gospel reading today. These 2 outsiders receive both the Spirit and power that had been given to Moses. And Moses' conclusion is, of course, hopeful for the Hebrew people. Would that not this same Spirit be given to all the people? So that's the connection that reading, I would suggest, has with the gospel today. To finish up, going back, there is mentioned here that those who, remember, were cutting off limbs and should be punished, would suffer the fires of Gehenna. Now, we may have mentioned this in the past, but I'd like to just quickly review that Gehenna was geographically the valley of Hinnom, which was west and south of the city of Jerusalem, and was the site earlier on of what were known as high places. Now, the high places were the ways in which other religious traditions honored their gods and goddesses by, well, a high place would often be built placing an altar or a pillar in honor of that that god. So this place, Gehenna, seems to have been the site in earlier times of other religions, and some of the practices that went on there, we have a record of this from some of the Hebrew writings, were very terrible, even the practice of human sacrifice, and that often the sacrifices that were offered were burnt. So hence the idea of fire. Now, here, this Gehenna is seen as a place of punishment. Now, let me conclude. I may have mentioned this before. It's important to notice that by the time we're thinking of Jesus, Gehenna had become the garbage dump for the city of Jerusalem. And you had to grow up in an earlier time to know when garbage dumps were placed outside of the city. People would bring their garbage there. And what you always did was to make sure that a fire was there so that your garbage was being burned. So it was not a place that you actually very much enjoyed. There was the heat created by the flames of this fire. There was obviously the smell that was produced by this. And there were also little critters who ran around seeing what they could get from the material that was left. So the fires, hence the word fire, that's what was, of course, important there. Now, I will conclude with this, that it says the fires of hell. Well, that's where our imagery of hell having fires, I might suggest, comes from. That we think of, because fire can be very, very painful. Anyway, there's a little bit of a background to the gospel for this time. Kind of notice there are a number of little pieces that you might reflect on as we certainly hope to use our hands, feet, and eyes in a way that bring glory and praise to others by how we do it, where we do it, and with the love and fidelity that we do it. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.